Chris Bova, and his presentation will come up right now. But Drop the Bass, probably one of the best titles of the conference.
Hi everyone, thank you for coming to my birthday. Initially this talk had a whole bunch of chintzy AI animations, but PowerPoint didn't allow it, so lucky for you. But today I'm going to talk about some research we did with CFIS and the Angling Diary with some help from the Angling Trust. And it's looking at non-compliance with European sea bass regulations in England and Wales. Okay, so just some run through what we're going to go over, some background of sea fishing, bass fishing in the UK, why compliance is a problem and why it continues to be a problem, the methods that we used in this research, overall non-compliance in the fishery, the drivers behind that compliance, and how we can potentially improve non-compliance. Okay, so this was a small part of a much bigger study. So our bigger study, it went out to Angling Diary anglers, and we got a total of around 350 responses back. But it was looking at overall non-compliance with all regulations. But this is really complicated in the UK because since the EU left the Common Fisheries Policy, now fisheries are managed by IFCAs. I think that stands for Inshore Fisheries Conservation. What's the A? Association, probably. Okay. And then Wales also has national bass regulations. And then, so we wanted to look at what is the extent of non-compliance, what's driving it, and if there's a way to fix it. So basically, recreational sea fishery in the UK targets a range of species, but sea bass is very high up on that list. In this study, it was obviously the most prevalent targeted and caught species. But since Brexit, the rules are a little bit unclear. So we tried to dig into the rules by looking at bylaws for each IFCA, and it was challenging to find them in the first place. But when we did find them, we made note of them, and then we would run it past the IFCA. Oh, can you check and see if these regulations are the ones? And they were like, we don't have regulations. So there's a bit of a disconnect still, I think, in some areas about what the regulations are and who's supposed to be enforcing them. But maybe they've fixed that since then. So here in this study only, we're focusing again only on European sea bass. The regulations that exist are around bag limits, 3 a day. It's controlled by seasons, and it's controlled by a minimum conservation reference size of 42 centimeters. So why do we care about recreational fisheries non-compliance? Well, why do we need fishing regulations? And I'm actually just reading that sign back there. It's not in my presentation. But if you see that sign, there's a whole bunch of reasons why we need regulations. And if people don't adhere to them, then all those whys are pretty pointless. So at the end of the day, compliance really undermines all of our management, non-compliance rather, really undermines all of our research that we're doing to inform policy, to create regulation, and so on. So it actually is and remains a very critical topic. So when we talk about non-compliance, we're referring specifically to a violation of existing regulations, and that's whether it's unintentional or deliberate. And when we're talking about unintentional, sometimes, as I said, the rules are very confusing for a lot of people. They don't know where to find them. So if you don't know the rules, it's really hard to follow them. So that can be unintentional. Where deliberate means you very clearly understand the rules, but you made a conscious decision to violate them. So understanding non-compliance, not just the rate of it, but the drivers behind it are key to actually effectively ameliorating it or getting rid of it. And basically, as I said before, high non-compliance defeats the entire purpose of management. If we can't get people to follow the rules, why do we even make them? So in this study, we developed questionnaires, and we administered them through Qualtrics online. They were sent out through the Angling Diary, and Hannah Rund also helped share them with fishing organizations to kind of share it around. So it is a little bit of a sample of convenience. But essentially, we wanted to understand target species the catch species, and then to see if people understood what the regulations were for the fish they were either targeting or catching. And then to sort of identify people's perceptions of enforcement, how often or frequently they see it or have been engaged with by law enforcement, their perceptions of legitimacy around the management agencies and around the regulations themselves, social norms, so looking at people's perceptions of what the norm of compliance is in the fishery, and motivations behind recreational fishing, as well as aspects of internal morality, which also can kind of dictate compliance behavior. This was a mix of panel questions for legitimacy and morality. For instance, there was a series of questions that can help classify you in a certain group of legitimacy or morality, which we'll cover. And then there are also some Likert items and also continuous variables. And we used a Bayesian logistic regression with these latent typologies as predictors. So overall, bass was the most targeted and caught sample. We got a total of 146 specific responses for bass anglers. And non-compliance within this fishery was around 24.2%, which if you're from South Africa, you think that's actually pretty good. But if you're from other places, that might seem, quite high, especially because, again, these are people from the angling diary and what we would assume would be probably a bit more specialized or well-behaved anglers in some ways. And also 21% of the sample was motivated by catching fish to eat over other options that involve recreation. If you look at the non-compliance breakdown, the biggest violation had to do with violating the minimum sizes, followed by the catch season and the daily bag limit. So when we look at some of the drivers, knowledge was quite high, other than with the seasonality, which was the second most violated regulation. But there was also quite a high documented misperception of the social norm. So essentially, the norm, if you look at the blue figure there, is around 24% non-compliance. But on average, people thought somewhere around 73% of anglers are actually non-compliant. And why that's important is that people typically follow norm behavior. So if you think that everyone's doing something, you're more likely to do it yourself. And then the overall enforcement presence appeared to be very low, so this variable wasn't going to be useful to begin with because everyone sort of answered the same way, but I'll talk more about enforcement in a second because we found out that it has some endogeneity and really a sort of thing that I should have realized a long time ago, but only realized when my model started acting up. So then we have morality and legitimacy, which we ran latent class analysis on, and it split basically legitimacy into three classes, which we have people who have like ascribed strong legitimacy to the management agencies and the regulations themselves. We have kind of like a neutral level where it's a bit of indifference around legitimacy, and then we have people who are very much in the ascribing weak legitimacy to the regulations and the regulatory agencies. And then in morality, we have two groups, where one is essentially the high levels of morality, and the other one, I can't really read. 40-year-old eyes are okay. So we used this latent class analysis to basically create these individual kind of typologies per response so that we could run that in the model in itself. And because we used a Bayesian model, we were able to use some informed priors because we do understand some relationships already exist in terms of behavior. For instance, you would expect that with higher knowledge, there would be lower compliance, lower non-compliance because more people would, or less people would violate them unintentionally. With norms, because of normative theory, we understand that people follow normative behavior, as I said before. With morality, you would think that people who have a higher moral compass for environmental issues would be likely to have higher compliance. So if you had conditional morality rather than a high level of morality, you were probably less likely to be compliant. And then when you ascribe legitimacy, strong legitimacy means you're more likely to follow those rules because you believe in them, where weak legitimacy means you would be less likely to follow them. And indifferent was our baseline. And then when we think about typologies, people who are fishing for food are also more likely to violate regulations out of necessity. So what we found is that moral orientation does matter to some extent. When we look at the conditional morality, it actually doubles compliance risk. However, this was not conventionally credible, which means that it overlaps one. You can see it kind of crosses that line there. So it gives us a good indication, but it's not awesome. The most credible and strongest predictor was social norms, which essentially showed that people who felt that others violated more frequently were more likely to violate themselves, as we kind of already assumed would happen. But this was ultimately, amongst all the drivers, the strongest. And so legitimacy effects were weak and uncertain. We found that knowledge has actually quite a small effect. Food-motivated anglers are also a little bit more likely to be non-compliant, but again, not if there was a such thing as significance in these models, it would be non-significant. Also, higher risk there. So at the end of the day, norms are key. They're a highly valid predictor. There's a misperception of the norm, and luckily we can correct misperceptions of the norms. We know there's norm correction theory and norm correction strategies. Nudges, social norms approach. Those are ways that we can address and correct this misperception of the norm to try and get people back to behaving better. So while these theories exist and while they're potentially usable, they haven't actually been applied really in the fishery. I mean, the nudge was the closest thing that we got, and that was still only a classroom study. So we need to rethink enforcement, just my last little bit here, because when I said there's endogeneity, basically what we found was would you expect more enforcement? Where there's more enforcement, you would expect people to be more compliant, because in deterrence theory, that threat of penalty is supposed to deter you from violating your behavior. But our model was initially showing, before I removed enforcement from it, that more enforcement actually meant more non-compliance. And then when I actually stopped to think about it, because I had to really dwell on it, enforcement patrols are not randomly stratified in any way. They actually probably are specifically pushed out to where people are non-compliant. So of course there's going to be more enforcement in non-compliant areas. So it was, at the end of the day, like a massive oversight. While knowledge, legitimacy, and morality and typology influence weren't actually credible in the results of this model, again, our sample size is quite small. If we had a bigger sample size, I think it would be able to tell us a bit more. So that's it. Thank you very much to everyone that helped out. Thank you to CFOS. Thank you to Hannah at Angling Trust. Yeah, thank you everyone involved. For the legitimacy panel, it was, I think, 5 for morality and maybe 6 or 7 for legitimacy.